welcome to the Craft Beer Corner. For today's beer review, we're jumping yet again into Browar Fortuna out of Miłosław, Poland. This is another beer that I caught at my local bottle shop. And yet again, it's kind of odd. I'm not sure what the deal is with the nomenclature, but this is another beer that at least appears to be titled Komes. I'm not sure if this is maybe like Browar Fortuna is the main brewer and Komes is actually like the sub-brewer owned by that conglomerate, and then they just call the beers by the beer name like some, and indeed a lot of European brewers do. But regardless, today's beer in question is a Russian Imperial Stout. This one clocks in at 12% ABV, and it does specifically mention on the back that you could easily store this at least up to 3 years, which 12% on an RIS, that absolutely sounds correct to me. So yeah, guys, been quite a while since I've had a Russian Imperial, and I absolutely love them. It's one of my favorite stout sub-styles, and Browar Fortuna, I've had 2, maybe 3 of their beers now to date, and I really, really like what they're doing there. So I have very high hopes for this beer. In terms of label art, it's just got this same kind of insignia on the top. Kind of looks like a dragon of sorts, and it's blue on the label here. It's nothing much else to talk about label-wise. Let's get this cracked. Poured it right in the old stout glass here. Oh yeah. Now this isn't pouring super thick. At least it doesn't look it, but it does look quite dark. So we'll see when we get in here. It's very active in terms of carbonation. I'm going to get right up on this. Okay, yeah. Yeah, head retention on this one, all but non-existent. It's already gone. It is what it is, guys. Poured at home. That's why as soon as I pour, I'm looking to see if it's going to do, anything major with the head that is going to make me want to have to jump in immediately on it. And obviously the camera's not picking this up, but looking at the top of this beer in the glass, you can just see effervescence still popping up. So it's very active. That is why this really didn't form or retain much of a head. This, could be the least impressive head I've ever poured from a stout at home. But look, it is what it is. I'm expecting this won't detract from the beer. And I did get the information out of it that I needed. This has a very roasty aroma to it. It smells very deeply roasted. And there's also this subtle kind of sweetness to it. So there's kind of this caramelly aroma in the back, kind of bordering on molasses, but a bit sweeter. So it's got an interesting kind of combination of aromas. Not one that you always find on a Russian Imperial, but it smells absolutely fantastic. Oh, it sure does. Very roasty indeed. Yeah, pitch black as expected. It's a 12% Russian Imperial. So guys, we're just going to jump right in and see what this one's about. Take one. Ooh, that's big. Oh, that's so big. Wow. That caught me off guard with that flavor intensity. It shouldn't have, but it did. Okay, so before we get into the flavor profile, let's talk about the body and let's talk about the weight. The body on this does not feel anywhere near as heavy as what you would expect for 12% Russian Imperial. I would say this feels like mostly a strong medium. On a 12% Russian Imperial, I would expect at least a bottom tier medium heavy. So it's not quite there. I would say this is below average in terms of breadth of the weight of it for the beer style and the ABV range. In terms of the mouthfeel, you can feel a ton of resistance. It did not look particularly thick when you were pouring it, but you can really feel the resistance there. So the mouthfeel is a completely different animal to the body. It's got a lot of resistance. It feels thick when you move it around the palate. This one doesn't get creamy, foamy, silky, velvety, anything like that. You can just really feel the thickness and the resistance on this beer. But it's a little bit strange. It's not often you get this, but the body just doesn't have a ton of heft, even though the mouthfeel is this thick and resistant. So, texture and weight, not exactly what I was expecting, but Come to the flavor profile, it's the same thing there. I wasn't expecting the intensity, and it's huge, huge. So what I was smelling on the nose really comes through in the flavor profile. This is intensely roasty. Indeed, there's a lot of even smoky, bordering on Rauch beer like undertones in this. So I don't know if they used any smoked malts in their malt bill, but this is extremely rich, it's extremely deep, it's extremely roasty, and there is indeed smoky undertones coming out of this malt bill. It's huge, it's bold, it's in your face, there's a big intensity. There's an intensity of flavor on this one that rivals some higher ABV barrel-aged variants of RISs that I've had. This is a big, big beer. It is not for the faint of heart. It is for people that like big, bold, pungent, flavorful, in-your-face stouts. That's exactly who this beer is for, and I personally love it. So I'm going to jump back in for a second sip. I'll let everything re-intensify, make sure I didn't miss anything, then we'll talk about the balance and the finish. Take two. Ooh, intense just punch. It's roast. It's almost got this, yeah, it really almost has this Rauch beer-like quality. There's very, very dark chocolate ribbons and layers that pop out of this. There's also coffee notes popping out of this. None of that is added into this beer. This is strictly coming out of the malt bill. So it's rich, rich roast, tons of char, smokiness, dark, dark, dark chocolate, and coffee. It's almost got all of the classic possible underpinnings of the richest flavors you could get out of a deeply roasted malt bill. In addition to that, there is a slight, almost sweetness, but it's more of a molasses-like quality. In tandem with that, there's also this slight undertone of like prunes and fig and raisins that pop out as well. It's much less dominant, but there is a fruity side to this malt bill as well. It's not all intense char and roast and coffee. There is a slight fruity side to it too. It just takes a few seconds to get there. I'd say it starts to pop in between about the 5 and 10 second mark after you swallow. And then it all kind of settles out on an even playing field. And you can really taste everything, all of those interesting kind of characteristics that were ebbing and flowing and popping in and out during that first 5-10 seconds. They kind of settle down and they hold steadily. So yeah, there's a lot happening in this beer. It's a very complex malt bill that they put together in this beer. I didn't expect it, but I'm really, really glad that I got it. So in terms of the balance, look, this is a beer style, especially on a non-barrel aged variant. It's all about the malt bill and the intensity of the malt bill and what they did using different types of malts. Whatever they used, I am a big, big fan. This is a big, complex Russian Imperial. It is a rather complex style in general, but this has a lot more nuance in it than your average Russian Imperial, to be certain. Make no mistake about it. This is a very complex beer with a lot of layering and a lot of nuance. And I really, really love the balance of these individual malts that they put together to make this base beer. In terms of the finish, this may not be a barrel-aged variant, but the finish is extraordinarily long. It really is a pungent beer, and even though it doesn't feel heavy when you swallow, if you move it around the palate, you can really feel that thickness, that viscosity, and it does a very good job of coating the palate. And that, of course, is going to lead to lingering flavor intensity on the palate that does push out the end of the finish. For a non-barrel aged Russian Imperial, this is, one of those god tier finishes. It's extremely wet, it's extremely round, all the way to the end, and there is just a massive intensity that lingers long after each sip. We're talking nearing the 2-minute mark, and this is not a barrel aged beer. This is just a standard Russian Imperial Stout. It's incredible. What I'm left with on the end of the finish is underlying kind of roasty bitters. Even though I don't get a huge bitter sensation, yes, there are some, but it's not like over the top for the beer style. But lingering on the back, there's roasty bitters. and still some of that underlying char and smokiness that kind of comes out. That's what you're left with at the end of the finish before, when, I mean, honestly, 2.5, 3 minutes, nearing that mark after each sip, it finally starts to dissipate to nothing. It's incredibly long and wet and round. Guys, this is a huge beer. I didn't expect it. I'm really happy with what I got out of it. I'm going to take my time, sip on this beer, count my scores. When we come back, we will get this one ranked from top to bottom. All right, now that we've gotten to enjoy this beer, we're going to get it ranked. This was Browar Fortuna's Komes, the Russian Imperial Stout version of this beer. This one clocked in at 12% ABV. Browar Fortuna is based in Miłosław in Poland. So yeah, another very good beer, guys, by Browar Fortuna. This was a really big beer, kind of a bit in a different direction than you would typically find in your average Russian Imperial. Notably that it had this very almost smoky Rauch beer-like char quality to it. You get that sometimes in Russian Imperials, but it's much less the norm than the exception. And this one was nice. It was very intense, and it's certainly for people that like big, bold, pungent flavored stouts, especially if they lean into that kind of smokiness. That's who I think this was brewed for, and I personally really, really enjoyed it. So overall, guys, this beer did great in most categories. There were 3 that I did not give a perfect score, so we will jump right to the categories in question. The first of those was the body. Now, the body on this was really, frankly, below average, considering that it's a 12% Russian Imperial. For my money, just sitting kind of on a low end of medium, you're typically going to have at least a strong, full, medium, heavy, oftentimes bordering on heavy in this ABV range for this style. This really was not, and it was below average, and I did give it a 3 out of 10. The next category that did not get a perfect score was the head and retention. Guys, this one tried. I mean, it kind of sort of formed a head as I was pouring it, but it was almost completely gone, like within seconds of having poured it. It is what it is. It was very active in terms of carbonation. It didn't personally detract from the beer drinking experience, but it didn't retain really almost at all. So head and retention only gets a 1 out of 10. The final category that did not get a perfect score was example of style. So in general, this was a very good example of the style, and indeed, I appreciated that it is an example of these kind of smokier Russian Imperials, which are quite a bit more rare than you're going to find for, you know, variants that aren't smoky at all. So on that end, I really liked this, and subjectively, I loved it. But it did lose some pretty big points, both in the head and retention and in the body, that I had to take some points off of the example. So overall, it lost 7 in one category, 9 in another. So 16 points total. That's pretty significant. So yeah, it's not going to be a perfect example. But I didn't think that what it lacked in those categories was really impactful enough to take away for what this beer actually did bring to the table. And indeed, I only took a single point off of example of style, so it does get a 9. And that does, of course, leave a perfect 10 out of 10 in the remaining 7 categories. That's aroma, taste, mouthfeel, finish, appearance, balance, and feeling/intangible, my subjective thoughts category. So the total score on Browar Fortuna's Komes, the Russian Imperial Stout version, is an 83 out of 100. So yeah, still well above average, guys. I mean, you know, if the body were heavier, had more weight to it, and if this actually formed a head, it would have had a very, very high score. But I have to rate it how I experienced it. But this is another one of those beers for me where, even though, yes, it is well above average, the score itself doesn't tell the whole story. I think that this is well worth the time of anybody that's into big Russian Imperial Stouts and people that also like a smokier beer. This is one you're absolutely going to love. It was very bold, it was very intense, and this is one I would absolutely recommend. Folks, that is today's review. As always, I do sincerely appreciate you tuning in today. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. If you want to stay in the loop when our videos go live, just turn on your notifications by hitting that bell icon. Till next time, keep it beer, keep it craft. We'll see you on the next one. Cheers.